It was always around midnight. The hostel's narrow corridor, once filled with laughter and gossip, became a pathway to terror. The lights would flicker, the air would turn cold, and then the sound would begin. Soft, deliberate footsteps, slow but growing louder with every second. Yet, when the girls opened their doors, no one was there. Those who heard the footsteps knew what it meant. By morning, one of them would be dead. Her body would be found pale and stiff, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror. There was no escape, no explanation, only the haunting certainty that the footsteps would return the next night. St. Mary's College was a quiet place tucked away in a sleepy town, known more for its academic achievements than anything else. But within the confines of the girls' hostel, a dark secret was festering, and it all started when a new warden, Ms. Harper, took charge. The girls in the hostel were used to a life of freedom and late-night chats, but Ms. Harper's arrival changed everything. She was a tall, stern woman with deep-set eyes and an air of mystery about her. She made strict rules about curfew and discipline, which irritated many of the girls, but there was something more unsettling about her presence. It started with minor things. The lights in the corridor began to flicker during the late hours. Cold drafts would sweep through the hallway, even when all the windows were shut. At first, the girls dismissed it, thinking it was just an old building showing its age. But then they started hearing things, strange whispers carried on the wind, and footsteps in the middle of the night. The first girl to disappear was Emma. She was popular, friendly, and well-liked by everyone. The night before she died, Emma had confided to her roommate, Sarah, that she felt like someone was watching her, especially whenever she walked through the corridor late at night. Sarah had laughed it off, thinking Emma was just stressed about exams. But when morning came, Emma's bed was empty. They found her in the garden, lying on the cold grass. Her skin was as pale as the moon, and her eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of unimaginable terror. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped, but the girls in the hostel knew it was something far worse. Emma's death sent shockwaves through the hostel. The girls became cautious, never venturing out alone, especially at night. But no amount of caution could protect them from the entity that haunted the corridor. 2 weeks after Emma's death, another girl vanished, Abigail. She had been talking to her friend Emily late into the night, complaining about the strange cold she always felt near her room. Emily had promised to stay with her, but as the night wore on, she fell asleep. When she woke up, Abigail was gone. The entire hostel was in a frenzy. Everyone was afraid. The once lively hallways became silent, and the girls no longer trusted the safety of their own rooms. Even locking the doors didn't help. Abigail's body was found the next morning, this time in the basement, her face twisted in the same look of fear that had taken Emma. The whispers began to spread. Some said it was the ghost of a former student, others believed it was the building itself that had become cursed. But none of the girls could explain the footsteps that echoed in the corridor each night. They would start faintly, growing louder, more menacing, but when the girls peeked out of their doors, the hallway was empty. Emily, a quiet girl with a love for history, decided she couldn't just sit and wait for the entity to claim another victim. Determined to uncover the truth, she began searching the college archives. What she found was a story that had been long buried. 30 years ago, there had been another death in the hostel. A girl named Eleanor had been bullied relentlessly by her peers. She was quiet, shy, and had no friends. The torment drove her to despair, and one stormy night, she vanished from her room. Days later, her body was found in the woods behind the college, hanging from a tree. The girls who had bullied her claimed they had nothing to do with it, but rumors circulated that they had pushed her too far. Eleanor's death was officially ruled a suicide, but the girls at the hostel whispered that she had come back to seek revenge. According to legend, Eleanor's spirit could not rest. The hostel became her hunting ground, and the girls who walked those halls at night were unknowingly stepping into her domain. Emily shared this discovery with her friends, Megan and Lucy. They were skeptical at first, but the more they thought about it, the more everything began to make sense. The deaths, the footsteps, the strange cold that seemed to follow them, they were all signs of Eleanor's restless spirit. Emily, Megan, and Lucy gathered in Emily's room after their haunting discovery in the archives. They were shaken by what they had learned about Eleanor, but something didn't sit right with them. Why hadn't anyone spoken of this before? Why did the school's administration remain silent, and how could Ms. Harper, the warden, act so indifferent? They knew they had to confront her, but the thought of doing so filled them with dread. That night, they approached Ms. Harper's office under the cover of darkness. The corridor outside her office was eerily silent, and a sense of foreboding filled the air. With each step they took, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, as though the building was alive, watching their every move. When they reached Ms. Harper's office, they noticed a faint light seeping out from under the door. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear her own breath, shallow and quick, as she reached for the door handle. Slowly, they pushed it open and found Ms. Harper sitting behind her desk, her face illuminated by a dim lamp. She looked tired, older than her years, and there was something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear. Without saying a word, the girls stepped inside, closing the door behind them. Ms. Harper looked up from her paperwork, her gaze locking onto them. The tension in the room was palpable. "You know something, don't you?" Emily finally broke the silence, her voice quivering. "You know what's been happening to us." Ms. Harper's face remained expressionless for a moment, but her eyes betrayed her emotions. She let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair, as if the weight of years had suddenly caught up with her. "I didn't want any of you to find out," Ms. Harper said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I suppose it was only a matter of time." The girls exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to expect. Ms. Harper stood up and walked over to a cabinet in the corner of the room. She unlocked it and pulled out an old dusty journal, placing it on the desk before them. "This belonged to Eleanor," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I was one of the girls who tormented her all those years ago." The girls gasped. They had suspected that Ms. Harper knew more than she was letting on, but they hadn't expected her to be part of the original group. The very idea that their warden was tied to the haunting chilled them to the bone. "She was never supposed to die," Ms. Harper continued, her voice cracking. "We pushed her too far, and she took her own life. But her spirit never left. It's bound to this place, and it's my fault." Ms. Harper's hands trembled as she opened the journal and flipped through the pages, revealing the final desperate entry Eleanor had written before her death. The girls leaned in, their hearts racing as they read about the ritual Eleanor had performed in a last-ditch effort to protect herself. She had believed the ritual would keep her safe, but instead, it had trapped her spirit in the hostel, fueling her anger and turning her into a vengeful entity. "I've been trying to contain her," Ms. Harper said, her voice barely audible. "But she's too strong now. She's angry, and she won't stop until she's taken every last one of you." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The reality of the situation was far worse than they had imagined. Eleanor wasn't just a spirit, she was a force of pure rage, and they were trapped in her domain. "There's only one way to stop her," Ms. Harper said, her eyes filled with fear. "But it's dangerous. If we fail, we'll all die." The air was thick with tension as Emily, Megan, Lucy, and Ms. Harper prepared for what would be the most terrifying night of their lives. The ritual, according to Eleanor's journal, had to be undone in the same corridor where her footsteps echoed every night. They had to reverse the binding spell that Eleanor had cast upon herself, a spell that had gone horribly wrong. As midnight approached, the girls gathered in the corridor. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and the temperature dropped sharply. Each breath they took came out in small puffs of mist. The lights flickered, casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. Emily's hands shook as she clutched the journal, her eyes scanning the ancient text for the words that could save them. "Are you sure about this?" Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, her voice firm but laced with fear. "If we don't stop her tonight, she'll keep coming for us, one by one." Megan, who had been the most skeptical of the group, now stood silent, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't stop thinking about the girls who had already died, Emma, Abigail, and how their faces had been frozen in sheer horror. Would that be their fate as well if the ritual failed? Ms. Harper stood at the far end of the corridor, holding a small box filled with items Eleanor had used in her original ritual, a piece of her hair, a photo, a lock of fabric from her school uniform. These relics, Ms. Harper explained, were the key to breaking the curse. As the clock struck midnight, the first sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually growing louder, more deliberate. The air seemed to thrum with a dark energy, and the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed as if they were alive. Emily began reciting the words from the journal, her voice shaking as the footsteps grew closer. Her heart raced, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the freezing cold. The lights flickered again, plunging the corridor into darkness for a few seconds before sputtering back to life. Then, at the far end of the hallway, she appeared. Eleanor's ghostly figure materialized in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes hollow and filled with rage. She wore the same school uniform from all those years ago, now tattered and stained. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque snarl as she moved closer, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Keep going, Emily," Ms. Hopper urged, her voice trembling. "Don't stop." Emily's voice faltered as Eleanor's figure drew nearer. The footsteps were no longer echoing, they were real, and they were coming straight for them. Eleanor's face twisted in anger as Emily recited the final words of the ritual, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, everything went still. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. Then, without warning, Eleanor let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was deafening, a mix of rage, sorrow, and pain. The walls of the corridor shook violently, and the lights exploded in a shower of sparks. Emily dropped to her knees, covering her ears as the scream echoed through the building. The temperature plummeted even further, and frost began to creep along the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for them, pulling them into the darkness. But just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Eleanor's figure flickered, her body dissolving into mist before disappearing entirely. The corridor fell silent, and the oppressive cold lifted. Emily gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. They had done it. Or so they thought. The hostel fell into an uneasy calm after that night. The death stopped, and the strange occurrences, the footsteps, the flickering lights, the cold drafts, seemed to vanish. The girls tried to move on, telling themselves that the nightmare was over. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ritual had seemed too easy, too clean. Could they really have banished Eleanor's spirit so easily after years of haunting the hostel? The doubt gnawed at her, but she kept it to herself. Megan and Lucy were eager to leave the memory of that night behind, and Emily didn't want to drag them back into the darkness. Weeks passed, and the hostel returned to its usual routine. The laughter and gossip of the girls once again filled the halls, and the terror of the past few months became a distant memory. But every now and then, in the dead of night, Emily would wake up, convinced she could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor. It wasn't long before the rumors started again. New girls moved into the hostel, unaware of the horrors that had taken place. They heard whispers from the older students, but none of them truly believed the stories. But then, strange things began happening once more. The flickering lights returned, and the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. And late at night, when the rest of the hostel was asleep, some girls swore they could hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing through the corridor. One night, Emily woke with a start. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. Her breath came out in small puffs of mist, and her heart began to race. She listened, her ears straining against the silence, and then she heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer with each passing second. Emily's blood ran cold. She threw off her blankets and rushed to the door, her hand shaking as she turned the handle. The corridor was dark, the lights flickering ominously. And there, at the far end of the hallway, she saw it. A shadowy figure stood motionless, watching her. It was a girl, her features obscured by the darkness, but Emily didn't need to see her face to know who it was. Eleanor. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure took a step forward, and the footsteps echoed once again through the corridor. Emily slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. How was this possible? They had performed the ritual. They had banished her. Hadn't they? The haunting was far from over. Eleanor's spirit hadn't been destroyed. She had simply been waiting, biding her time. And now she was back. Emily knew she had to leave the hostel. She couldn't stay there, not with Eleanor's vengeful spirit still roaming the halls. But as she packed her things, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. What if Eleanor wasn't just bound to the hostel anymore? What if she had found a way to escape, to follow them wherever they went? The thought sent a chill down Emily's spine. She looked out the window, half expecting to see Eleanor's figure standing in the darkness, watching her. As she left the hostel for the final time, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The footsteps, once confined to the corridors of the hostel, now seemed to echo in her mind, haunting her every step. Years later, new students moved into the hostel, oblivious to its dark past. And while the stories of the hauntings had faded into legend, those who listened closely late at night could still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, footsteps of a girl who had never truly left. The end, or perhaps, just the beginning.